Hello, in this presentation we're going to look at the circular flow of income, and as you can see this is related to aggregate demand and supply. So what I've done here is I've taken what I think is a nice diagram from Sloman and Garrett of this to try to explain this circular flow of income. Now if we look on the left hand side you can see an industrial unit at the top. Now obviously it looks a bit industrial here, but let's imagine that's say like an events venue or all the events venues in the UK, and at the bottom there you've got a house which perhaps represents consumers, so people in the economy. So you've got industry at the top and then you've got people, consumers at the bottom there. And if you follow the blue line round from the industry at the top, you can see there's what's called factor payments. Now these are, an example of this is where people are paid wages. So obviously people take them home into their houses, but they also, as you can see going up the other side, they consume domestically produced goods and services. Now they're going to pay money for these, and that might include actually attending events and purchasing tickets. So if we go back to that industry at the top, if that's an event management industry, they may be paying wages to people who are working in that sector. That could be hospitality staff, it could be the event managers. They're taking that home and then they in turn are actually spending money in the economy, and that could be on events. So you get this cycle of activity there. Now there's some other things there. So if you look at the red lines, these are what's known as withdrawals. So sometimes that money doesn't go straight back into the economy because, for instance, people might save money, they might put it in their bank. People pay taxes, and people might spend money in other countries. So you might buy products from other countries, or you might actually have a holiday or travel to go to an event in another country. And that represents an import expenditure because you're buying something in another country and importing it to the UK. Even if you physically travel to an event in another country, that counts as an import because you're spending that money in another country. And as you can see, it's also known as leakages. And then in the green lines, we have injections into the economy. So, for instance, the banks might invest in certain industries. There might be government expenditure. So the governments sometimes subsidise events because of the benefits they bring to the economy. And there may be export expenditures because people might come from other countries to attend an event in the UK. So what we're going to look at now is aggregate demand. So this is the total spending on goods and services made within the country. Okay, and that's that definition there. And you can see the spending by four groups. So there's the consumers and goods and services, and the letters refer to the previous diagram. I'll take you back to it in a moment. Firms on investment, government on goods, and people abroad on the country's exports. So, as I say, this is people attending events from other countries in the UK. So if we go back to that, that's all on the right hand side, the top half of that. So there's people paying to go to events, there's investments in events, there's government expenditure, and there's export expenditure when people come from another country. And then from that, we would subtract the imports, and that gives us the aggregate demand. And in terms of aggregate supply, this is the definition there, is the total amount that firms plan to supply at any given level of prices. And on the whole, that's generally more stable, but it can fluctuate. So I've got an example there of, where, one thing might be the input prices might change. So, for example, oil prices rose quite dramatically in 2008, and they actually had an impact on business events because it actually raised the cost of travel to those events. And you might have, for instance, new regulations. So one of the things obviously we've seen happen recently with COVID-19 is that new regulations might come in whereby that might mean that there needs to be more staffing of certain activities, and that would actually put up the prices and the costs of actually supplying, say, a live event. So now we've got, as usual, a graph here. So first of all, we'll have a look at the AD, the aggregate demand curve, and this slopes downwards. And this is fairly logical because if you look on, the left-hand side of that, when the price level is low, then you're likely to see, a greater demand. But also you can see a number of things that are mentioned there. So first of all, there's an international substitute effect. So as you know, what tends to happen is that, you know, as prices rise, people will buy less in the UK and actually buy things from other countries. There's also an intertemporal substitution effect, and this is where, as prices rise, there tends to be, you know, a demand for more money, so people borrow, and interest rates rise, and then actually this discourages people from borrowing. They save money and they postpone their consumption. And also you can have what's known as a real balance effect, and this is related to people's purchasing power and availability of goods. So people's purchasing power is to do with their income levels relative to the price of goods, you know, but sometimes obviously their purchasing power could be greater than the supply of goods, and that can therefore affect the demand. And then if we look at the AS curve, the short run AS curve, so this is the aggregate supply curve. This you know, slopes upwards because as prices rise, so does profitability for the firms. But what you see is it begins to rise quite sharply in the end because of diminishing returns, and you know, potentially down to things like this shortage of variable factors. You know, and I've talked to you before about in the microeconomics about the availability of space in a venue, you know, and you run out of capacity to put more staff in. So the equilibrium level is at where those two cross, and actually if you move down the short run aggregate supply curve to point B, P2, there is actually a shortage, you know, which would drive the price back up to the price E. So if there's more demand than supply, you know, it will drive those prices up. And now we're going to look at what's known as a positive demand shock. So here we'd see the aggregate demand curve move to the right, and this could be that there's a, you know, a sudden shift in consumer confidence. You might see an increase in exports. So that generates more demand. Could be lower interest rates, the company willing to borrow money, and there could be an increase in government spending. So basically what we'd see is that if the aggregate demand shifts to the right, what you will see is that that companies will want to begin to supply more, okay, to re-establish that equilibrium. And also we could look at a supply shock. So here we've got the supply curve moving over to the right as well, and that means there's an increase in aggregate supply, and this could be, you know, for instance, to do with a decrease in some major commodity price, like a decrease in oil prices. It makes it more cost effective to produce something, and again, you know, what you'll see is there's greater output, but here there is greater output at lower prices, so the prices will drop. So the companies can produce more, but they can actually sell them for less in that case. Whereas if I just go back up to, you know, in terms of the positive demand shock, this is where actually they can you can supply more and actually increase the prices. Okay, so this is a bit of a brief overview. There is plenty more you can read on this if you want to understand this further.